I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar, Breaking the Glass Bottleneck, the Economic Potential of Black and Hispanic Real Estate Developers and the Constraints that they face. This webinar is sponsored by ICIC and presented jointly by ICIC Grove Impact and the Siegel Family Endowment. The webinar will start with an overview of the report, and then we will move into a presentation of the main findings of our report, and introduction to the interactive map and directory that we've created as a networking tool. And then I'll come back and present a summary of the report's main recommendations. We'll hear a reaction to the report's main findings by Bo Menkiti of the Menkiti Group, a longtime friend and collaborator of ICIC. And then we'll have some closing comments and some time for questions. Before we get started, let's have all the presenters just very briefly introduce themselves. I'm Howard Weil, Research Director of ICIC.
And
Peter.
I am Peter Eberhardt, Senior Associate at ICIC. And I will hand it over to Laura.
I'm Laura Maher, Head of External Engagement at Siegel Family Endowment.
Hi, I'm JB Schramm, Managing Partner at Grove Impact.
And hi, I'm Derwin Sisnett, co-founder at Maslow Development Inc. and lead partner at Grove Impact.
And hi, I'm Bo Menkiti, founder and CEO of the Menkiti Group and a longtime participant and fan of ICIC.
Thanks. So let's, without further ado, move on to an overview of the project that led to this report. And that will be by Derwin Sisnett and JB Schramm.
Great, I will start. For a little bit of background, Grove is a social impact consulting firm. We're comprised of social entrepreneurs who've built national organizations and movements. And what we do is we look for leaders who have a big idea, and we provide them with a team of social entrepreneurs who can help them accelerate their idea. Bo Menkiti, who you'll hear from later, came to us with a powerful vision for more effectively capitalizing Black and Hispanic real estate developers. And as a result, we built a Grove team led by Derwin Sisnett and partnering with Laura and her colleagues at the Siegel Family Endowment. So Derwin, I'll let you take it from here.
Sure, thanks, JB. So as JB shared a couple of years ago, we actually, as we began this work with Bo, we began a qualitative study to better understand the field of real estate investment from the perspective of minority developers. And we conducted interviews with real estate developers, impact investors, philanthropic and financial institutions. And what we found pretty much overwhelmingly was that while financial institutions and real estate developers had personal stories and anecdotal evidence that spoke to the representation crisis in the real estate development space, there was very little research, if any, that quantified the lack of capital access for Black and Hispanic developers particularly. And so we realized that data were absent from the conversations, which is when we teamed up with the great folks at ICIC to conduct a quantitative research analysis to better understand the field. And in the midst of that, what also bubbled up was the need to create more visibility for developers of color, which is when the idea of the Directory of Black and Hispanic Developers was born. And of course, none of this would have been possible without the support of the Siegel Family Endowment, which is actually went way above and beyond just financial support, but human resource capacity, which is where I'll pass it off to Laura to share a little bit more about their work.
Yeah, so just high level about Siegel Family Endowment. We are a family foundation, and we look at the impact of technology on society across our three interest areas of education, workforce, and infrastructure. And I think there was a couple of ways that the stars aligned and on this project. And the first is just, in the overall mission. I mean, for us, we had been sort of longtime funders of, tech and tech adjacent career training, thinking about how to generate more wealth, but we came to this moment of sort of inflection about like how not just to train people, like, which is obviously very important to focus on individuals, but really how do we make the whole economy more equitable and work for more people? And so when, Grove approached us with this idea, it was a problem that, they were exposing. It was so stark. It was so vast. And it was definitely something that we wanted to shine a light on and really dig into. I think another thing that drives us at Siegel too is just like being more tech and data native. Our founder is a PhD computer scientist, runs a big quant trading firm. So data and research has always been a part of our DNA. That, actually putting the numbers behind what we already knew to be true, and seeing that it was even more stark than we thought it was going to be. So I think just the data drivenness too of the project was something that really spoke to us, and we thought would have a really powerful ripple effect on getting people to actually listen and pay attention and create a baseline set of metrics against which we could improve. And then I think the third thing was that it wasn't, to the point about creating the directory, it wasn't just, research, which is obviously extremely important. It said, we exposed the research, and then there was this big action platform. We wanted to create this directory. We wanted just to say, like, here's a problem, and here's like one way we could start tackling this as a solution. Like, let's expose where all these developers are. Like, let's make them really public. Let's like celebrate them. Let's make this something that people want to participate in. So I think the research married with the action of the crowdsourced directory was a wonderful combination that for us has just been a really great partnership. And so, yeah, excited to get into the findings today and to walk you all through more about the research and the directory and what we see as, next steps going forward.
Well, thank you all for the background and some of the motivations behind the work. Without much further ado, I'll jump in and start talking about some of the report's key findings. And really, we divided these findings up into 5 main areas. The first is, which as some of my colleagues alluded to, is probably not very surprising to those of you who know the real estate development industry, is that there is a representation crisis. However, despite that, what we found is that many Black and Hispanic developers are successful, and we'll unpack what that finding means in a little bit. And then, looking further into the market, there are some challenges that Black and Hispanic developers face. There's a revenue gap for medium-sized Black developers, as well as revenue cliff at 17 and 50 million in annual revenue. And then finally, we took these findings, the representation crisis, the revenue gap, and the revenue cliff, and we modeled what the world or the industry might look like if those problems were solved. And we demonstrated the large potential economic benefit of solving these issues. So first, the representation crisis in the real estate development industry is acute. On this slide, I have a chart showing comparing the real estate development industry to several other industries, all business owners, as well as the total population. So you can see here that 14.7% of the US population are Black or African American, but only 0.4% of real estate developers are. Similarly, 18.7% of the US population is Hispanic, but only 0.16% of developers are Hispanic owned. So combined, Black and Hispanic developers represent less than 1% of their industry, which is much less than the broader real estate rental and leasing sector, as well as much lower than the percentages for all business owners. And despite that underrepresentation, we found that many Black and Hispanic developers are successful. The largest segment of the industry for all developers are small developers. That's true in many industries, so that is not particularly surprising. But what we did note is that small Black and Hispanic developers generate more revenue than their white-owned peers. And this is something that we have been exploring, and we've received lots of questions. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? And I think we're still working to unpack exactly what's behind this finding. Although what we've been hearing from many developers, and we actually just had an executive roundtable yesterday, and this issue came up, is that access to capital, especially for small developers who are just getting started, is a real challenge. And that Black and Hispanic developers report facing more scrutiny and having more difficulty getting that initial capital, whether that be because of less access to friends and family type funding, or just because of additional scrutiny from banks and equity providers and debt providers. So that challenge, that additional challenge, could mean that the developers who do get funding, who do actually get into the industry, need to have better projects, need to be more prepared to succeed than their white-owned peers. So shifting from sort of the smallest developers, we also found that at the very top of the market, Black and Hispanic developers are engaged in larger deals than white-owned developers, and actually substantially larger median deal size, 60.4 million for the largest, or the Black and Hispanic developers at the top of the market, compared to 43.8 million as a typical deal size for white-owned developers. And some of the reasons behind that may be related to what I was just talking about, in terms of the challenges getting funding and the need to be better prepared than peers. So shifting over to some of the challenges that we identified, or some of the roadblocks, the constraints that we identified, we found a revenue gap for medium-sized Black developers specifically, that adds up to $600,000 less in average revenue for these medium-sized Black real estate developers. Hispanic and white developers in this category actually generated pretty much identical amounts of average annual revenue, but this revenue gap does add up to, in aggregate, a large amount of funding and a potential wealth generation that is being missed out on. And then moving up the market from there to the largest Black and Hispanic developers, where we define that at 17 million to 50 million, and then 50 million plus. We find a really acute and severe drop-off in terms of the number of developers that are actually represented. So between 17 and 50 million, we only found, our data included 6 Black developers and only 1 Hispanic developer, compared to 382 white-owned development firms in that revenue category. And then above 50 million, we found 0 Black developers, and our data included only 1 Hispanic developer, compared to, again, 382 estimated white-owned developers in that size category. And that the fact that those two numbers for white developers are equal is just a coincidence. Just happened to be how the data shook out. And this particular finding is particularly important because this is where the vast majority of revenue is generated. It's a disproportionate share. 80+% of the revenue being generated by developers is being generated by the very largest developers, which means that this is where the most wealth generating potential is, as well as just the most potential for broad economic impact. So taking all of these findings into consideration, the fact that Black and Hispanic developers are acutely underrepresented, the revenue gaps for medium-sized Black developers, and the revenue cliff for large Black and Hispanic developers, we wanted to ask ourselves, what would the industry look like, or what might the industry look like if these problems were solved? And we wanted to be able to to quantify that and put a number on the economic potential that we are leaving on the table and that we are not currently tapping into. So we developed a simulation to model that, and we found large potential economic benefits to removing these roadblocks and removing these constraints. To add those up, we found that there would be more than 54,000 new Black and Hispanic developers if we were to address the representation crisis and the revenue cliff. There would also be more than $106 billion in new revenue every single year generated by these developers. And these development firms would employ 1.7 million people. So these numbers are profound, and they demonstrate that we are leaving lots of economic potential and lots of wealth generating potential, lots of employment potential on the table through these constraints that Black and Hispanic developers face. And actually, I should note that these findings are these findings assume that the new Black and Hispanic developers would not displace anyone who's already in the industry. So we modeled real, genuine, just growth in the industry, which is probably very desperately needed. We are in this country facing an acute housing crisis and an affordable housing crisis. And so we need new developers, we need more developers, we need more housing and more development to be done. So this is good for Black and Hispanic developers, the people who would be employed at these firms, as well as for all of the rest of us. So as my colleagues alluded to and mentioned, we've also developed a map and directory of Black and Hispanic developers. And we really created this because we wanted to help connect investors, lenders, grant makers, developers, journalists, and really anyone who wants to do business with or support Black and Hispanic developers. We wanted to create a resource so that those people could actually find Black and Hispanic developers. No one had done this type of work before, and it was there's a lot of manual work involved in going out and finding all of these different companies. My colleagues also mentioned that this map and directory are crowdsourced and they're actually ongoing. So we are currently still inviting Black and Hispanic developers to reach out and nominate themselves for inclusion in the directory. And we've been adding, even since we released the report just at the beginning of March, we've added some new developers into the directory. And I want to take a quick look at the actual directory, just to give you a sense of what that looks like and to make sure that we all have an opportunity to see that. So I am going to quickly switch my screen so that I can show you the directory. Great. So the map and directory, it's combined into one website. And at the map level, we have information, we have aggregate information by state. So you can see the number of Black and Hispanic developers in each state, the ranking per Black and Hispanic resident compared to all the other states, as well as those local impact numbers that I was talking about in terms of removing the constraints and what the economic potential of making the industry more equitable and more fair could be. Similarly, if we have more micro level information available in the directory, so we have for individual metro areas. So for many of the metro areas in the country, you can go in and see how many Black and Hispanic developers are currently in the metro area. You can take a look at the ranking per Black and Hispanic resident compared to other metros, as well as the hyperlocal or relatively local impact numbers the projections. And then if you zoom in further on this map and directory, you can actually find the individual developers and their locations, as well as we've made available the directory just in a very simple directory format with company names and ownership status, addresses, as well as websites when those are available. As I mentioned, we are actively inviting Black and Hispanic developers to nominate themselves to join the directory and to have their company listed. So if you take a look at the directory and you find that your company is not listed, we would love to hear from you, and we would love to have your company added to this list. Additionally, we've been talking about some opportunities for expanding the directory potentially in the future. This is still very new and very ongoing, but we've received lots of interest from our audiences and from developers to expand into different groups and to include different types of development companies. So this is very much a living project and something that is going to evolve over time, and we very much welcome and encourage feedback and engagement with this tool. And now I will turn it over to Howard Weil to talk about some of our recommendations.
Thanks, Peter. So this report, as Peter mentioned, is the first of its kind. There has not been any previous work on Black and Hispanic owned real estate development companies. And as such, we intend the report to be a jumping off point, a starting point for future research and future action. And we have recommendations in 5 major areas: research, public policy, new initiatives, networking, and finally, hiring and promotion by existing real estate developers. On the research side, our report identifies strengths of Black and Hispanic developers and challenges that they face, but it doesn't talk about why those constraints or why those advantages actually exist. So that is an area for future research. Why do these revenue cliffs exist? What happens at $15 to $17 million in annual revenue that makes it difficult for Black and Hispanic developers to jump over those cliffs? Is it a problem of access to capital at those levels? Is it a problem of access to large projects? Some combination of those two, something else? Those are all areas for future research. On public policy, we identify the Community Reinvestment Act as a powerful lever potentially for changing behavior. Right now, the Community Reinvestment Act requires banks to report on lending by geography to give them an incentive to lend in under-resourced neighborhoods. But geography, as we all know, is not the same as race, and the CRA doesn't say anything explicitly about race. We have recommended that the CRA be amended, or more likely that the regulations for the CRA be changed to require banks to report on their lending not only by geography, but also by race, to give banks an incentive to lend to Black and Hispanic borrowers. Next. We recommend new public, private, and philanthropic initiatives. Initiatives should focus on getting more Black and Hispanic people into the real estate developer industry, and also helping existing Black and Hispanic real estate developers grow. And that can be done through public, private, philanthropic initiatives. It can be done through direct funding. It can be done through creation of business accelerators. can be done through any number of methods, and there are some existing models out there, such as the Black Squirrel Collective in Philadelphia, which was created by a group of Black business people in Philadelphia to create an accelerator for existing Black developers to help them expand and grow. Next. Networking. Existing developers and investors and other capital providers should expand their networks to include more Black and Hispanic people in the development industry. And to that end, our directory is an important tool to help facilitate that kind of networking, to enable Black and Hispanic developers to find each other, and equally important, to help the others who are interested in doing business with Black and Hispanic developers to find those developers. Next, please. Finally, existing developers, regardless of ownership, can, through their hiring, through their recruitment, through their retention and promotion policies and practices, do more to help build a pipeline that will eventually lead to more Black and Hispanic owned real estate development firms. With more Black and Hispanic people in the industry as employees, eventually there is a pool of more Black and Hispanic people who are available and who may decide to become, to start their own companies and become owners. So those are our starting recommendations. We welcome further. Let me now turn to Bo Menkiti for his reaction to our findings from a developer's perspective. Bo, how do our report's findings align with what you're seeing as a developer? Are there other challenges? Are there other recommendations that you would highlight? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Well, thanks, Howard. I think just a little perspective, to put in context, my journey and where I'm coming from on this. Started our company, the Menkiti Group, 19 years ago. At that time, I was a part-time real estate agent, and I owned one rental property. So to put that in perspective, sort of started from the bottom and had the opportunity to learn and grow and make lots of mistakes along the way. A couple of things that I just want to highlight and that resonate for me from the report. The first is, I think the report shows this higher level of activity at the smaller stages, which I think is to be expected for a growing segment in an industry. But it also speaks to the fact that most of the initiatives and interventions or programs that are being put in place are really at the top of the funnel. And we've seen some amazing programs put in place to get folks early on their journey to start new companies or to help their companies get off the ground. But what I would point to is a gap, which I think you see borne out in the data, that there has been little to no focus on once those organizations are successful. If 50 start, some remain small, maybe one or two are in a position where they have the capacity and have hit a niche that allows them to grow. But right now, there's very little attention being paid to what are the challenges for those organizations to grow. And one of the questions that, I was having dinner the other day with a couple of other folks of color in the industry, and somebody posed the question, when are you too big to need any help? When are you too big to need any help? And I think what they were getting at was this sense that the minute you became successful in this space, there was a quick sense that you no longer needed any support. And I think that speaks to an opportunity to really look at this cliff and to look at the gap that's created in the middle of the market here. And that's what we've seen sort of anecdotally in our journey, and what we're trying to address with the Obsidian Catalyst Fund that we are getting ready to launch, which is focusing on that sort of missing middle capital for Black and Hispanic developers that are looking to scale, that have proven themselves capable of scaling, which is another piece of this too. Not everybody should scale, but organizations that are in a position with a track record and the capacity to scale are being restricted from scaling. And how do we address that gap? And what we've seen is that there's a big gap in between the early stage grant money, program money, friends and family money that people cobble together to do a few small projects. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the institutionally financed and structured deals. And it's in this middle space that we're seeing, a real challenge in scaling diverse development firms. So I think that's where we're hoping to address that with Obsidian, where we're bringing sort of high impact, market rate return capital into this space and helping support. Sometimes it's projects that are of that mid-size, call it equity amounts that are greater than, 3 million and under 25 million, which is, sort of where you start to engage institutional equity, that there's a space in these mid-sized projects for an equity provider to help proven Black and brown real estate companies scale. And that there's also a role in helping firms tee up large development projects, that the money that goes in early to get site control, to do pre-development expenses, that often that core, sort of sponsor, general partner initiative and investment that helps tee up the access to institutional capital is missing for a lot of our peers. And so we're excited about that initiative and moving that forward. Just a couple other things that jumped out, and maybe see if there's any follow-up questions. I think the first is that this really is, and I love how the research points to this. This isn't just an equity or a justice issue, right? This is really a competitiveness. It's a competitiveness of talent and a performance issue for how we look at investments. Because not only are we missing out on a whole swath of talent, we're also missing out, as we've sort of articulated in Obsidian, on a whole set of real estate assets to which these developers are proximate and have the capacity to execute on in a way that other development companies might not. And so I think from a capital sort of industry segment, we have to start looking at this not just as a mission piece, but as a sort of industry. There's a domestic asset class in urban America and a whole set of talent in the real estate space that's being overlooked and passed by. And these are sort of undervalued assets, highly talented people with great potential upside. And so from a pure capitalistic perspective, we're missing out on a huge piece of our economy. I want to just a couple of nuanced things. One is you pointed out that a lot of the medium-sized developers had a larger deal size. I would posit that a lot of this might be due to their participation in public-private transactions, which on a whole tend to be larger, and the large number of programs that have, minority or diverse set-asides. So a number of real estate deals in this country are getting done with a minority developer partnering with a majority developer especially on municipal public-private deals. That can be a great way to get participation, but I think it fails and it falls short of realizing the full opportunity of diversity in real estate development. If you think about it, when a diverse company is participating as a minority partner, they are getting exposure to that deal. They have people working on that. They're building up their staff. So there's great things happening, but they are not actually driving the top of the food chain that drives this industry. They're not selecting the architect. They're not selecting the general contractor. They're not choosing the consultants. And so what we found along the way, and I think the McKinsey study on diversity shows this, that basically organizations that have diversity at the higher levels actually benefit more from diversity because they benefit from the diversity of perspective and decision-making, not just from participation. And so, that study says, hey, folks with diverse staff perform a little bit better, diverse management perform even better, diverse leadership and executive team perform better, and diverse boards perform the best. And so this question about how do you put Black and Latino developers in a position where they are making decisions, they are accountable for their decisions, and we're benefiting from their perspective, which brings additional capability, perspective, and experience into the realm of our built environment and allows us to enhance that space. So I think that's a really important piece of this, of ensuring that there's not just participation, but that there's participation and leadership and decision-making within that process. And so we've structured the Obsidian Catalyst Fund to really provide that capital to highly proven, experienced, and scale-ready developers to allow them to take that step to play a lead role in development projects where we can benefit from, and their communities can benefit from, their depth of understanding, the nuance of their perspective, as well as their technical expertise in the real estate profession.
Thanks, Bo. The interplay between research and practitioner perspectives and practitioner involvement is exactly what we want to catalyze through this initiative. And so we're very, very grateful, as we always are, for your insights. To wrap up our presentation, before we turn to questions, I will turn it over to Laura.
Maybe Laura, before you dive in, I was just gonna, in terms of next steps, and feel free to add some additional color, just really quickly, as it relates to next steps, we wanna definitely leverage the directory and build out tools and research to increase the capital flow to developers of color. And as Peter mentioned earlier, we hosted an executive roundtable just yesterday, Laura, JP, and the folks at ICIC, to do a bit of a deep dive into a particular area of the study. So we'll look to continue efforts like that going forward. We'll also develop tools that help to equip Black and Hispanic developers as they gain access to capital. So our hope is obviously that this report helps to leverage that, and then therefore we can provide some additional tools to support them in those efforts. And just the reality is there's so much work to be done, but at the same time, we're excited to leverage the results of this research to guide our next steps. And so I don't know, JB or Laura, if you had anything to add to that, but just wanted to share a little bit of preview of next steps as we move this work forward.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I was gonna say, I just wanted to pick up on something Bo said too, and it's something that I've been talking a lot about just from the philanthropy angle, is like, this is not a philanthropic endeavor. Like, this is an asset class and there is money to be made here. This is a good investment. So for us, as a foundation, like there's ways that we feel like we can support. We amplify findings. We elevate civic leaders. We support place-based initiatives and people, and we see ourselves as a convener. But like, at the end of the day, this is just a great investment, which is another finding from the report, and that's just something I want to drive home, that this is an actual investment. Sorry, JB, did you have anything?
I will just add, in addition to the point Bo made around the opportunity in terms of investments that are getting overlooked, there's an opportunity in terms of community development, and that when you see those revenue cliffs at the $17 million and the $15 million levels, what that speaks to is that the largest scale firms, the firms that are large enough to compete for and take on major urban projects, are not by and large led by Black and Hispanic leaders. And so that proximity gap is resulting in the firms doing the biggest urban projects that are affecting the most Black and brown, the lived experience of most Black and brown people, are not benefiting from the proximity. So figuring out how to remove those cliffs and make it possible for developers with that proximity, with top grade skill, to build firms that can compete and win the biggest projects in the country. That's going to have an impact across communities.
Thanks, JB. Now we have an opportunity for people in the audience to ask questions. You can either put your question in the chat or raise your hand. We already have one question in the chat how do we define revenue? Is it fees, rents, sales? What combination of those two? Peter, maybe you can respond to that one.
Yeah, happy to. So that is really all of the above. When we're looking at revenue, we are looking at top line revenue or just the business's total income for the year. So that would include any fees that the developer charges to a customer, any rent that the developer does happen to bring in, the total income from a property sale. So not just the profit, but the total amount of money coming into the business in a year.
Great. Steve Grossman has a question.
Yeah, I'd like to ask our colleagues a little bit of a question related to educating, coaching, training, and mentoring these emerging real estate developers. ICIC has created a series of cluster-based programs over the past few years, one around the food cluster, a second around construction subcontractors for BIPOC and women-owned subcontractors. Do you think there's a market for these Black and Hispanic-owned real estate developers to participate in a program similar to what we run for other cluster, which would give them some of the very specific tools they might need to accelerate their growth, whether it's long-term mentorship, specific technical assistance related to the industry, capital issues, et cetera. Is there a market for that in your judgment? And is it something we might want to pursue as we further expand our cluster-based education and training work?
I can quickly jump in and curious, Bo, to get your thoughts on this too. The short answer is yes, there's a need for it. There are programs like that exist. They're certainly more locally based programs. And I want to say that, even at the national level, but still dispersed locally, there are programs for emerging developers of color. I think there's still the challenge of typically what happens when these programs wrap up are, you get your certificate, you are now, you go forward as a developer, but you still don't have the capital to actually make to actually move your business forward. So I think what's sorely lacking in these programs, the ones that I know of at least, are just the capital that should come along with starting, that new venture, if you will. But I know, Bo, you may have some experience in that as well.
I just say in that vein, one of the things I think could be interesting that ICIC has done well is the Inner City Capital Connections program. What is missing, as Derwin pointed out, is a lot of the cohort-based programs are combined with a grant or some sort of seed investment from those programs, but they do not have as much focus on how folks capitalize their deals beyond that program. And a number of the ones that we're highly familiar with, someone just asked, what are these programs? Capital Impact Partners, now Momentous Capital, runs a wonderful program in a number of cities around the country for emerging developers. Amazon has funded something similar to this. And what we've seen is, and the Amazon one actually came with capital for them to use, for the developers in the program to use for development. However, what they're being given is usually some seed capital or some small amount of capital. And it is challenging, especially as folks grow, to figure out how do they actually structure a deal? How do they go get the debt capital, the other equity capital they need to make that work? And so I think a capital connections type of space that was heavily specific to real estate and how real estate deals get done could be very interesting.
Well, we're going through a strategic process right now, thinking about the next generation of programming. And I respectfully would rely on some of the people on this Zoom call and others whom you could bring into it to advise us how not to replicate or repeat or be redundant. As Derwin suggested, you don't want to be redundant. On the other hand, what's the deliverable, what differentiates it, and what creates a true value proposition? So Thank you for those insights.
And Steve, I'll say that while these programs exist, I mean, we see the numbers there where the, you know, myself included, Black and Hispanic developers are underrepresented in terms of access to capital, but there's still, you know, if you look at the numbers and what the report shows, there are so many more that could come under, you know, come into this work with the kind of support. And so while programs exist, we could use plenty more of them. So I wouldn't say we're at the stage of redundancy just yet.
Thank you.
Colleen Fonseca has a question.
Hello, everyone. I'm Colleen Fonseca, the Executive Director for the Builders of Color Coalition, which is a nonprofit based in the Boston commercial real estate sector, working with developers of color and real estate professionals of color. So Steve, would love to actually touch base with you to talk a little bit about some fellowship training programs that we've been running for developers of color, mostly operating in the greater Boston market. So I do have a question. Firstly, really excited to see the research that has already been done. This research has actually answered a lot of questions and given us lots of guides as an organization into future iterations of programming, as well as to really highlight and elevate how deeply profound this problem is. So just really want to say thank you all for the work that's been done already on this front. One question that I did have is in relation to the directory. I'd love to find a way to connect some of the developers that are in our network to plug into that directory. So I would love to figure out how do we sort of, as organizations that have relationships with developers and have sort of like directories of developers as well, how do we sort of get that information to be housed with you all's directory as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there. That's an excellent question and exactly the kind of thing that we're hoping to do with this directory. So we have a contact email on the directory page, as well as we can share some contact information with you. So really, if you reach out to us, we're happy to, you know, go back and forth over email or set up some time to chat and then figure out how we can get the developers who are in your programs or in your network, how we can start to work to get them into the directory. But yeah, that is exactly the kind of use case that we're hoping for.
We have an email on the site, but I'm going to put it in the chat as well, and you can just send the names and websites of the organizations, and we'll look at them. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
By the way, great article about Colleen and Builders of Color Coalition, Boston Business Journal this week. And Colleen, look forward to getting together with you soon. So let's touch base.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Don't see anyone else with their hand raised, but we have time for
Hello,
more questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
Have you heard anything from BlackRock? And do you recommend, you know, up and coming developers to hire like a consultant or find a mentor that can help them get access to like programs like Amazon or you know, and other programs like that?
Yeah. Happy to speak to that. I think I'm super passionate about this issue. I believe that one of the biggest barriers, and I guess I say things sometimes a little controversial, but I think one of the biggest barriers to success for especially Black developers is the predominant narrative that of exceptionality, that if you make it as a person of color, you are exceptional. That we were a phoenix, we rose from the ashes, we walked uphill to school with no shoes twice a day and had no mama, no daddy, and whatever. Like that story that people put on us and that we often embrace because it makes us special is directly in conflict with building a great development firm, because fundamentally development is a collaborative business. And I love your question, Jules, because fundamentally, this is a business you don't succeed in by being exceptional by yourself. It's a business you succeed in through partnerships, through relationships, through network, and through community. And so I believe that one of the biggest challenges we face as a community is that even the programs that are put in place to support developers of color pit developers of color against one another and don't bring them together. And we have spent a lot of time, because if there's only, I mean, let's take Boston, for example. If I've got a set aside and I need to compete out an RFP and I all need to find a developer of color, well, then everybody goes and finds their own developer of color and everybody's competing against each other. And we went through this in DC and decided that, hey, the best opportunity was when we could sort of come together to build the collective strength to do that. And so I would say, just kudos to you for asking the question. There's a lot of resources out there. Happy to, if you want to shoot me an email, happy to connect you to some. I can put my email in the chat. But I think this idea of how the community works together, I mean, the work that Colleen's doing to bring people together, that this idea of how people can come together and leverage their strengths and what it requires in terms of transparency and vulnerability to say, I'm really good at this, but I'm not good at this, is how I think we can really elevate together.
Thank you.
We have time for more questions, more observations, if anyone has anything more to ask or add.
I do have a question or a comment. My name is Paula Villatoro. I'm actually from the Builders of Color Coalition as well. I'm the research manager. And this has been very interesting just to watch and to read about how you guys came to this research and your methodology. Sorry about that. And I've, like, in your last point of I believe it was like your 5 key findings. One of the things that you mentioned was the removing the constraints for Black and Hispanic developers, and how that's like kind of missing as to like how do you do that and best practices. And at the Builders of Color Coalition, we're actually taking on some research and advocacy work, working specifically in access to capital, project access, and education. And we just started this work, we're just undertaking it. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts, or like how is your future looking on partnering with organizations that are currently already doing this work and kind of like knowledge sharing and creating a space for that?
We can't do enough of it. I mean, as much as we think we're building coalitions and partnerships, we're barely scratching the surface. And we're running a program for construction subcontractors. There are developers out there. How do you create an ecosystem? I mean, a true ecosystem where those who have been marginalized are included in across the board. So I think that, I mean, Bo made the point, and I think was a eloquent, although a sad point, that there's so much competition going on that people are finally, frankly, competing against one another rather than working in a collegial and collaborative way. So to the extent that we can see this as part of a broad-based coalition building and ecosystem building initiative where developers are a key piece of this, but other subcontractors, suppliers, and other members of the community are invited into it, I think there's dramatic room for far more coalition building than we've engaged in up until this point. And we spend a lot of our time working on precisely that question.
Yeah, and to echo that and to build on that further, Derwin made a really great point during our roundtable yesterday. As authors of this report, none of us individually see ourselves as experts. We are collectively building this expertise and this knowledge, and we really do view it as a collaborative and collective effort to understand the industry, understand best practices, as well as to make an effort. So certainly welcome and the collaboration, and see that as a critical and essential piece of this work.
I know we're reaching the end of the hour, but my mother's 101, and she told me when I was 8 years old, she said, Steve, when people do something nice and supportive, don't forget to say thank you. I mean, this initiative that started with phone calls well over a year ago, involving a lot of players and a lot of people, Bo, Siegel, Grove Impact, ICIC, and others that Howard and Peter and others are more familiar with than I. I mean, this could not have happened without that kind of partnership. And you got to sometimes we got to leave our egos at the door and participate in a way that truly creates something unique and of value. New York Times wouldn't have spent so much time, effort, and energy if they didn't think we collectively were onto something. We've got a lot of momentum behind this. The question is, how do we maintain the momentum and accelerate this? And that's a question for another time. But I'm a big believer that momentum can take you so much farther than you could ever imagine going. We've got a lot of momentum behind it. Question is, what's the next step? Or series of steps?
Well, we're almost at time. Thanks so much to our partners at Grove, JB and Derwin, to Bo, to Laura at Siegel, and to Peter, and to everyone in the audience for all their provocative questions and observations. And as we've said before, this presentation and this report are just a first step toward advancing Black and Hispanic developers and building a broader and more successful community. So thank you all again, and have a good afternoon.